Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Paul Lewis, the Policy Director here at the Eno Center for Transportation. Welcome to day 4 of our Transit Cost and Project Delivery Symposium. We're really excited today to wrap up the discussion talking about some of the specific things that are happening around this country. We've had a lot of great discussions this week talking through our work and other peer work. We've also had some issue-specific panels and really great participation on those. And so now in our ultimate day, we're kind of looking toward the future and want to hear from some folks around the country about what is happening in specific regions. And so this particular panel is one of 3 concurrent sessions that are 4 concurrent sessions that are looking at specific regions. This one's looking at Los Angeles. Los Angeles is one of the regions where a lot of transit has been built in the past 20 years. We reviewed 14 different projects as part of our work, and those projects have all had a huge impact on the mobility and accessibility of the Los Angeles region. And today we've invited some experts to talk about that. And I'm going to invite them on screen in just a minute. Just a few housekeeping items. This is an hour-long session, so it is noon here on the East Coast, and depending on where you're dialing in, it's different times. But we will end at 1 p.m. Eastern time, so 58 minutes from now. There will be a 30-minute break, and then our final panel will begin at 1:30, where we'll talk about how Eno's work is going to be in the future and get some feedback from you all about things we can be working on. This will be recorded, as will the other concurrent sessions. So if you want to switch and hear other sessions, you can, of course, do that on the agenda tab in your socio panel. You can also watch the recordings once they've posted here not too long after these sessions have concluded. And of course, if you have any questions on the live stream, you can enter those into the chat function on the right-hand side of your screen, and I will be able to see those and ask those to the appropriate members of the panel. So with that, let's get started. I'm going to invite my fellow panelists onto the screen. We have 4 folks from the Los Angeles region joining us. First is Julie Owen. Julie is Senior Executive Officer of Program Management Oversight and Program Control at Los Angeles Metro. Welcome, Julie.
Thank you.
Next up, we have Ray Tellis, who is the FTA Region 9 Regional Administrator. Hi, Ray.
Hi, Paul. Good to be with you.
Thanks for coming. Third up, we have Rick Thorpe. Rick is the former CEO of the Expo Line Construction Authority. How you doing, Rick?
Hey, great. Thank you.
And last but certainly not least, we have Lisa Morath, who is the infrastructure lead for Los Angeles at Parsons. Hi, Lisa.
Hello there.
All right. So let's talk about project delivery in the Los Angeles region. All of you represent different facets of the project delivery ecosystem, and we're all folks that we talked to as part of our research and found your remarks and insights particularly compelling. So what I want to do is to make sure we have a good understanding of your background experience. I want to go around the horn here and just give you a minute or two to introduce yourself a little bit more, talk a little bit about your experience and background, your current role, and what you've done in the past. And so we'll start with Julie and then go Ray, Rick, and then Lisa. So Julie, why don't you kick us off?
Great. So Julie Owen with LA Metro and Program Control specifically. I started working on behalf of Metro in 1992, believe it or not, on the Red Line. So I lived through the Red Line days for 6 years of my life, and then moved on to other companies, and then came back to Metro, and now I've been working for Metro 13 years on a variety of projects. Right now we've got 54 projects and $21 billion in construction here right now at Los Angeles Metro. So managing the program control department, which comprises cost, schedule, estimating risk, and then document and change control staff on all these projects. So excited to be here today. Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, a huge responsibility for, I think, the most active transit construction program in the country. So that's great. Okay, let's go hear from Ray. Ray at the Federal Transit Administration is overseeing federal grants in the region. Ray, go ahead and give us a little bit more about your background and experience.
Yeah, thanks again, Paul. Ray Tellis. So I'm currently the regional administrator for FTA's Region 9 out of San Francisco that covers the jurisdiction of California, Nevada, Arizona, and Hawaii, and the territory. So in that context, previously I was the director for the FTA's office in Los Angeles. We have a large office in Los Angeles primarily to serve the Los Angeles program. So in that context, I was there for 20 years overseeing Metro's capital projects if they were federally funded. And more recently, over the last 2.5 years as a regional administrator, of course, I remain engaged in terms of the Los Angeles program, the Los Angeles projects. As you said, Paul and Julie have alluded to a huge, huge program, probably approaching the biggest in the country. And with that, huge amounts of federal dollars going towards the program, towards the capital projects. In that context, we provide oversight that has worked extremely well. And that really is how I've been engaged over the last 22 years with the Los Angeles capital program. Thank you.
That's great. Clearly, plenty for us to learn about, and so we'll be asking you lots of questions about that. Let's shift over to Rick, who's spent a lot of time at the Expo line and the construction authority there. Rick.
Yeah, thank you. I'm currently a senior advisor providing consulting services to LA Metro on the East San Fernando Valley Light Rail line. Before that, I was the CEO of the Exposition Construction Authority. Also worked at Metro as their Chief Capital Management Officer for about 5 years. And before that, went to LA to be the CEO of the Gold Line Construction Authority. So I've had quite a bit of experience in LA.
Yeah, and certainly we'll be asking both about the Gold Line and Expo line as part of this discussion. All right, so let's hear from you, Lisa, the current representative from the private sector in the region at Parsons.
Yes, thank you, Paul. And unlike everybody else, I have spent my entire career on the private sector side. I've worked for a number of large consulting firms, currently with Parsons. I've been here about 3 years. And like Julie, my first rail transit project was the LA Metro Red Line. And I was part of the GEC team at the time. My role was on the project controls and estimating team. After that, I had a few changes, made my way to Minneapolis and Chicago of all places. But when I was in Minneapolis, I was with the program manager as the project controls lead on the Hiawatha LRT, which I believe was the very first design build new starts project. Eventually made my way back to LA about 15 years ago. And since that time, either myself or my firm has been deeply involved in the Gold Line East Side Extension, Expo 1, Expo 2. Currently, Purple Line, and then I had a large role on Regional Connector during the preliminary engineering phase of that. Now my firm Parsons is working on the Purple Line Section 1 and the Gold Line Foothill Extension Phase 2. So touched most of the major rail transit projects in LA in some way or another during my career.
That's great. So clearly there's a lot that's happened in the LA region. And one of the reasons we chose Los Angeles as one of our case studies is because of the long history. And from starting in the 90s, really kind of ramping up in the last decade, the region has built a tremendous amount of rail transit. And some of that has been some of the least expensive on a per mile basis in the country, right? Some of the Gold Line extensions in particular were quite inexpensive, to some of the most expensive and most complicated, like the Purple Line extensions that are happening right now, going through the western part of the region. And so I want to talk about some of those, and especially since both you, Julie, and Lisa mentioned that you started your careers working on the Red Line in the 90s. We'll start with you, Julie, and just talk a little bit about how the approach to delivering these big projects has changed over the past 30 years. And what has the region learned in terms of making projects happen in a more time efficient and cost efficient manner? Julie? Uh-oh.
Sorry about that.
Nope.
Back in the Red Line days, there was a decision, and I don't know based on what, but what had happened basically was that they decided to do design, bid, build projects. And there was a design, bid, build contract for every station on the Red Line, a tunnel contract, for different segments, every systems contract, a separate contract. I believe the strategy was that would increase competition, etc. There were complicated contract interface milestones, so that you would have access dates for some of these systems contractors that were coming on board. And it ended up being, we had one major delay, a sinkhole on Hollywood Boulevard, that ended up with a major ripple effect, and impacted every single contract as a result. We learned from that, and those were all design, bid, build. So when that delay happened, then we owned the delay, and it rippled through every single contract. Now for the past, Rick would know more about this than I would, because it was during his tenure probably when it started. But design build, we've been doing design build for over 20 years. We let out design build for an entire corridor. So we're managing one contract as opposed to, 25 contracts for one corridor. So that shifts a lot of the risk from the agency, and actually staffing too. When we were on the Red Line, we had, a big team of people that were delivering that program for design, bid, build. Now for design build, we've got some efficiencies, where staffing efficiencies, and we've shifted a lot of that risk, or shifted the risk to the contracting community. So we do multi-billion-dollar mega design build contracts now, and that's what we've been doing for a while. However, interestingly enough, and I'll talk about this later, based on, we do contractor market sounding analyses every 2 years. We talk to the marketplace, because we've been noticing that we've been getting fewer and fewer bids compared to other owners, similar owners. And we've been asking why. Why is that? The contracting community has been saying that we've been shifting too much risk to the contracting community, such that they're deciding in some cases not to bid our projects. And they're more interested in alternative project delivery. So possibly we've been looking at, maybe a CMGC, progressive design build, where there's a better balance of risk between owner and contractor, and more of a partnering type of approach. Because the other challenge we have on not all, but some of our design build projects is we end up in a, changes in claims type of arena, where you're having to combat against those types of things, where possibly a more negotiated type of procurement, where you've got partnering, would result in a higher upfront price, but not the same changes in claims type situation. So we're investigating that right now. That might be a direction we're going. So that's what we've learned in the past 25 years.
That's really interesting. And one of the things that we picked up in our case study was and highlighted the fact that when LA Metro does do a project, they take each project individually and kind of look at whether what procurement approach makes sense. And we thought that was a really interesting approach. Now, I want to hear from you, Lisa, on the private sector side, right? And have you seen similar changes? Has that been one? Did Julie's comments resonate with you, of course, on the risk side of things? And then what else might have you noticed over the past 25 years in terms of how project delivery has changed and what's been for the better?
Yeah, no, I think Julie gave an excellent assessment of where the agency was, back in the 1980s versus where it is today. Just as they have developed lessons learned, so have we on the private side. But what's great, and Julie alluded to it, is Metro is listening to the industry. So it's not just capitalizing on their own internal lessons learned, but also the external lessons learned that are coming from the private sector, whether it's the market sounding sessions, one-on-one meetings. And we really, we appreciate having a voice, and a seat at the table. I'd commend Metro on being flexible and being adaptable to the industry. Certainly, what we've found out on the delivery side of the design build, is that there's a significant amount of risk. Some that we can identify and quantify ahead of time, but a lot that we can't. Particularly in a very complicated urban area like Los Angeles. So, everything that we can do, together to make sure that those risks are appropriately shared, I think will be for the good of the program.
Now, and I want to talk to you, Rick, next, because one of the interesting things about the Los Angeles region in terms of delivering projects over the past 25 years is that LA has used these independent construction authorities, which are not housed in LA Metro. They are truly independent bodies tasked with designing and building and constructing these facilities, and like the Gold Line, like the Expo line, and then handing them back to LA Metro for operations. This was something that was used for those two lines I mentioned, but LA Metro is moving away from that model. Can you talk a little bit about your experience with the construction authorities in particular, and how do they work well, how do they not work well, and how does that play into the current situation where most of the work now is all controlled directly through LA Metro?
Yeah, thank you. I'd say probably I've now run two construction authorities in Los Angeles. Probably the biggest benefit, and is also a downside, is it's usually run by a small board of directors. The good news is you can make decisions quickly because that's their sole purpose. They don't have any other political agendas or other things that they have to deal with. So basically, we would meet on a monthly basis, and that was their sole function, is to make decisions regarding the project. That being said, it was also something that had issues, I would say, associated with it, because it was usually a small group of elected officials, usually from within the project limits. there was political pressure from their constituents to make betterments, and then those betterments would be translated and directed to the authority to implement. So there was a fine line. We made decisions quickly, but some of those decisions ultimately added cost and time to the project.
Yeah, the betterments issue has come up in a lot of regions, certainly not least of which is Los Angeles. And so I definitely want to talk about that in today's conversation. But Ray, I want to hear from you because you have a unique seat at the table, right? As FTA, not only a grantor of significant resources, but an oversight agency that's can kind of take a little bit of a step back and see what's going on. In your experience, I mean, what has the region done well, and what is it doing well, and how has it changed?
So I think the region has done well. Los Angeles Metro, in particular, have learned. They are in a unique position. They are one of the few agencies in the country that have multiple projects going on at the same time. Not to mention multiple projects in the program. Many jurisdictions have one project. For example, Metro is doing 5 tunneling projects now at the same time. So you have the opportunity for lessons learned, and they've done many in the past. I mean, so that's one factor. You bank on lessons learned. You learn from one, and you carry it forward to the next. You can do it almost immediately when you have a program that's that broad and certainly has that many projects. Um, some of the things we recognize and we saw and were pleased were in the past there was this doing business with Metro factor, right, that impacted the attracting of contractors and skilled labor and all of that. And they brought in specialists to not only turn around at one time the entire agency, but through the blue ribbon commissions and through the procurement departments and or department and other departments like Julie's project controls have brought in prescriptive measures to contain costs and contain schedule or at least predict them far better using tools that they've not only learned along the way, but technology is further along, but it is simple tools, geotechnical um, surveys and verifications and utilities and understanding their utilities and a toolkit that really has them tying in and understanding what suits each project better. You've heard now that they're also looking beyond design build because that might not be best suited in every instance. You talked about betterments. You talked permits is a big factor, right? So you need to have the delivery method that really addresses how you are getting permits, how you're dealing with third parties, third party utilities, and all of those things across the board. So sometimes design build is better suited. Sometimes it's just not. And I would argue, and FTA looks at this from the perspective that everything you do should be commensurate to risk. And how do you address risk? And I think not to brag about what FTA has done, but we have an oversight program with engineering firms serving as our contractors, our oversight contractors, and we've brought that to the table with the funding to say, let us help you, let us get you. We have a common goal of getting to the finish line. Let us look at your processes. Let us suggest, let us provide advisory comments. We are not doing project management. We are doing oversight. It's a clear distinction. It has to be a clear distinction. But we have tried to best we can help the process, assist, and bring our resources in that context. Recognizing that Metro in themselves have gone a long way to make amends, to do things better. And that formula has worked quite well and is only getting better.
That's good to hear. And I want to pick up on the one thing that you said was the betterments, right? And I think this is I see Julie raising her hand. Julie, do you want to jump in before I ask my question?
Yes.
Please go ahead.
Because I didn't mention earlier, some of our lessons learned, we had a construction best practice audit that came back and said at the time we were doing design build for basically everything. And the auditor said, you need to have a process by which you select your delivery method. So we implemented a project delivery method selection procedure. We implemented a project readiness review stage gate review procedure. We implemented a lessons learned procedure. And then we also implemented, per what Ray just mentioned a moment ago, a risk management procedure that we apply now on all projects, not just our federal projects, where we do qualitative and quantitative analysis for lessons learned. And regarding betterments, betterments are going to happen. You can't avoid betterments. And one of the things that is an issue is sometimes when you're delivering a program of the size that we're delivering right now across all of LA County, it's really important to maintain a couple of different things. One of which is consistency of approach across the region. So you're applying rules across the region for all of the stakeholders, all of the cities, 88 cities in Los Angeles County. So that's important. It's also important too to maintain relationships. So sometimes these betterments that come up, situations happen where it's really important. Those cities want that betterment, and we need to make that relationship last, because we're going to be dealing with this city on the next project and the next project, and we don't want to forsake that relationship. But I really liked your report that said we need to have a policy whereby we enact when betterments occur, how they are funded, knowing that betterments are going to occur, right? And then having a cost sharing mechanism to where if the cities want betterments, which they're going to, then how do we make sure that we have some cost sharing to where they're not just, because the betterments are not ever eligible for federal funding, so they become a cost risk to the agency. So just wanted to chime in with that.
Yeah, no, and I certainly appreciate that. And one of the things that we found in our report is that when we talk about betterments or requested improvements from the community, there's certain, a lot of times they make for better projects, right? And so one of the challenges that agencies have, of course, is understanding which ones are appropriate and which ones are out of scope. There is a question I see in the chat coming in, and maybe Julie, you can just provide an example of what is a betterment that you've seen, maybe a couple of specifics that you've had to deal with recently.
Betterments come usually from our third parties or cities where they want something added to the project that's not part of the project scope. So they may have, and what happens usually, especially on our design build projects, are that these cities are approving our plans, giving our permits, and they say, hey, I've got this situation here. I'd like you to address it. So I want you to completely replace this utility that was not part of your scope, that's within the limits of your project. Or, hey, 2 blocks away from your project, I need to go pave the street over here or do new sidewalks, right? So it's not the scope of your project, but it's something that they want, and they end up putting that as a condition to the approval of your plans, right? And then you're in this predicament, right? What do? You need to have your plans approved, right? So we have to constantly go through this analysis of whether or not we can approve it or can't approve it. In some cases, we'll have somebody say, actually, we're having a situation right now at UCLA where they want a second entrance, right? That wasn't part of the project scope before. Who's going to pay for this second entrance? That has to happen, right? So these kinds of things there are additional scope elements that are requested that weren't part of the prior project budget, and are cost increases, and they're not eligible for federal funding because they're another way to consider it would be like an enhancement to the project. So Ray, any comments, any additional feedback?
I would agree. Sometimes betterments are part of the project, as you allude to, in which case we could provide the funding for them. But if they happen after the fact, and that's scope creep and added scope, and sometimes we call it gold plating, really, our hands are tied. We can't at that point provide additional federal funding to cover betterments. And it is how you really look at your master cooperative agreements and other agreements that you have with cities and third parties to adhere to that. And I think even here, Metro has paid a big price in the past, but is coming closer to engaging the cities and having them be part of the project and recognizing their responsibility when you have a project in your city that's going to enhance the opportunities for your communities. It's a give and take both ways. And so I think the philosophy of betterments has to change, and I'm already seeing that it's beginning to change in Los Angeles.
Yeah, and maybe Rick, you can provide a little bit of extra insight on this issue of betterments, and how do we shift those discussions with the cities, with those third party stakeholders, more towards the planning phase, so that they're not popping up once we've signed an agreement with a construction firm or a consulting firm, and it doesn't end up being a change order. I mean, how do we make that process better? What based on your experience?
Well, I think you're right as far as um, encouraging these discussions during the planning and environmental stages, especially things like a second entrance to a station. But there are also some betterments that are requested, and it's primarily a result of the design process. We go through 30, 60, 90% design, and there are things out there that the city doesn't know about until they actually see the design. For example, we had city requested 9 new fire hydrants in the city of Culver City. That they should have had all the time, but our project allowed them to request a betterment to ensure that those fire hydrants got in, and they weren't going to approve our plans without it. And those are things that you run into as the design process goes along. So I think there's both aspects. Yeah, it should, some of the bigger things should be done in the planning process, but there's also betterments that are not going to be known until the design is actually progressed. Now, as far as trying to minimize that, I agree with Julie. You've got to work with the cities, try to get some cost sharing agreements in place, and work with them to let them know that they're going to have to provide either all or some of the cost of these betterments, and encourage them at the beginning of these projects to establish their own budget, because Julie's right, there are going to be requests for betterments. Everybody knows it, and it's just a question of who's going to pay for it. And to the extent that you can get cities to agree to budget ahead of time for some of these betterments, the better off you're going to be, and the faster you're going to be able to implement some of these betterment changes.
Got it. So feel like we could talk about betterments all afternoon. I want to shift gears a little bit because it's related, and something that I picked up on when you're talking about this is that the region's gotten better at managing this, in part because they have more experience. And so the staff experience and capacity, not only of the public institutions, but also of the private sector, has grown, I think, and matured quite substantially over the past 25 years. And so Lisa, this one's going to be for you, talking about the capacity of the staff, not only in your organization, but in the public sector. How have you seen that mature, and how can we continue to develop public and private sector expertise to help manage these very complex projects and these very complex issues that come up?
Yeah, that's a compound question there. And I'll just start with the current situation. Here in Los Angeles, LA Metro has a major capital program. Even beyond the rail transit expansion. There's highway work, there's regional rail work going on. On top of that, you've got LAX undertaking a multi-billion-dollar expansion program, other large infrastructure programs going on in the region and the state. I think all of the private sector, as well as the public sector, is very challenged and continues to have concerns about the capacity in the region, both on the professional services side as well as the skilled labor side. We are continually trying to attract talent from outside of the region, both internally and externally, to come to Los Angeles. I think it's a great place to live, but it's difficult because we have one of the highest costs of living in the whole country. So it's a challenge to transplant people, whether they work for our company or somebody else, without some significant costs, whether it's covering travel costs so that they can maintain their permanent residence, wherever they are in the U.S., or relocation costs. And with that, there's a couple of options. How we cover those, whether it comes from our overhead or whether we pass those on to the owners. And we've done it both ways. So in light of that, one thing we're seeing, not that this is necessarily anything new, is a lot of the large firms, again, whether it's a consulting firm or contractor, are forming partnerships, for specific projects or specific programs, so that we can maximize our collective capacity and kind of, balance resources based on availability. We all have projects at different stages of the delivery process. So, we can optimize who's available if we can draw from, more than one large firm to, keep the project on track.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of building capacity beyond that, I know Metro, as well as several of the other agencies, have programs to encourage primes to mentor smaller firms. So we've done that as well, either adopting mentoring a smaller local firm to help them grow, develop their capabilities, their business savvy, their technical savvy, or even sponsoring smaller firms from outside of the region, just to help set up shop here in LA. It could be by offering them some office space, or bringing them on, as a sub-consultant on a couple of local projects, so that they can start to learn about the region and our unique, regulations, policies, and so forth. It's something we've got to all be very focused on and creative, in order to deliver and keep the region moving, because it really is it's a massive need here.
So I'm going to shift to Julie, because Julie has at the public sector has some unique constraints. So Julie, your thoughts on this?
Well, first I needed to correct myself, because one of my staff just told me that I got the station name wrong a moment ago. It's not UCLA. It's actually Wilshire Rodeo for the city of Beverly Hills. And we do have an agreement where we're working that out from a payment perspective. So making sure I'm being recorded, I got it right. It's fixed now.
Always appreciate the correction.
Yeah. Then regarding the labor pool, I just wanted to chime in for just a moment. But talking specifically, because we took a market analysis to our board, we gave a market analysis last month, said one of the biggest challenges we're going to have in the LA region is workforce, right? And especially the construction workforce. Where are all the people going to come from, especially as we gear up for the Olympics? And as Lisa mentioned just a moment ago, housing is a big issue, right? So we've been looking at a couple of innovative things. One is our Win LA program right now that we have, where we partner with community colleges, looking to see if we can expand. And those community college programs right now that we have are looking mostly for operations-based careers, to increase our operations force. But we need to start looking at possibly expanding that to be construction trades as well. And then hopefully honestly, beyond LA County, partnering with Riverside, San Bernardino, San Diego, outside, possibly maybe outside of California too, to start to get craft labor, because it's going to take people from all over the region. Because we've predicted we're going to peak at, right now our capital program is $3 billion a year, and it's been growing. 10 years ago, it was $1 billion a year. Right now, it's $3 billion a year. And the next 3-4 years, no, 2026, it's going to tap out at 2026 at $5 billion a year capital program. Can you imagine? Wow, that's a lot, right? But trying to get the craft labor to get people from out of state. So if we figure out how to increase the labor pool, right, then the next answer is going to be what Lisa talked about, is where are you going to put them, right? Because housing is such a barrier to get into the LA market. So we're looking at a couple of innovative strategies related to, and right now this is really feasibility. Right now it's just a concept, but can we build, say, dormitory type housing in our staging areas? Can we put a percentage of our, of our TOD program or our, as craft labor, right? Or what am I trying to say? That's not the right word, but we have some of our affordable housing. So in our affordable housing projects, can we put a percentage to be part of craft labor? So, and then from an agency perspective, from a labor pool, right now we're having to leverage the consultant community to help us, because we really do not have the capability to grow that quickly, that will meet the needs. So Lisa's team, and then Rick is working for us on East San Fernando as well, to bring in those exports to help augment our team. But at the same time, there's got to be a balance, because there's some things that only Metro staff can do, like a project manager is a great example. Metro has to make Metro decisions, but then we can have a team of consultants working for them. So what's the right blend of mix of Metro staff to consultant staff? These are things that we've been looking at as well, related to labor pool.
That's great. I'm intrigued by the out of the box thinking. That's really compelling. And I want to ask the same question to Rick. LA Metro has an institution, right? And they were able to build up the capacity over a long time. You were in charge of a few construction authorities that had to start from scratch. So how did you build that internal capacity on short notice? And to what extent did you use a blend of in-house project managers versus consultants, and kind of how that works?
Yeah, we definitely, in order to ramp up, use consultants quite a bit. But as Metro is finding that you need decision makers to be in-house and part of your team, we basically, at that time, which was 20 years ago, there was a bigger supply of talented people out in the public and private sectors. And fortunately, we were able to tap into it at the same time. But I think one of the things was, we decided to go to the design build route. One of the reasons was so we could keep our staff to a minimum. So we didn't have to find 100 people to hire to get the project going. So we were able to focus on key management people. We were able to pull them out of the private and public sectors. Because we were a construction authority, we weren't constrained by certain pay grades that others might have been in the public sector. So we were able to provide some salaries that were above even what the private sector was paying at the time. And we were able to get some really talented people. And certainly that is one of the major reasons of the success of both of those projects, both the Gold Line and the Expo line.
Very good. Ray, just want to make sure you have an opportunity to chime in here, particularly on the staff capacity standpoint. Does the limited supply of talented people, does that ring true to you and your office?
It does. It does, because as Lisa mentioned, the cost of living and attracting people at the federal government salary isn't always the most lucrative. As you know, we do pride ourselves in what we do, but nonetheless, particularly in San Francisco, attracting good talent, quality subject matter experts, whether it's in planning, environmental engineering, always has us struggling to get good candidates. In fact, many a time for the San Francisco office, we place the individual in Los Angeles, because while Los Angeles is expensive in comparison to San Francisco, it's perhaps a lower cost of living. So we have the same issues now with passage of the IIJA and a growth and staggering increase in our program. We will have to recruit many folks to be able to deliver the program. We just did it with the COVID-19 relief funding, 6 times what we get on an annual basis. All of that takes resources, and initially, staff is spread thin, and this happens with projects as well, right? And this compromise to safety and other things that are really a concern to the FDA on projects. But we have the same woes, and we do our best to recruit. Once we recruit, retain, provide incentives, provide opportunities, and then really rely on the gratification of the work you do to keep you with the federal government, with the FDA.
That's great. So I want to shift gears a little bit. And one of the things that we highlighted in our report was this really compelling story about the Purple Line construction that's ongoing. There was a lot of concessions made in Beverly Hills to minimize traffic disruptions during the construction of the station. And then the COVID shutdown happened, and you were able to move that station forward much faster. Because they were allowed to work a lot more because there weren't cars on the road. This was early in the pandemic. And I want to, this question's for you, Julie, about that kind of trade-off, right, between minimizing disruptions to communities during construction versus the rip the Band-Aid off approach of a more 24-hour like construction and disruption, but then the project's over much faster. In that particular community. How does an organization like LA Metro balance that with its local communities, particularly given the fact that a rip the Band-Aid off approach, while more disruptive, could be substantially less expensive?
Well, first off, I want to start in answering that question, and that the relationship, we would have never been able to do what we did at Rodeo had we not developed that relationship with, in this case, the city of Beverly Hills, the local jurisdiction. So we spent a lot of time, care and feeding with Beverly Hills, who quite frankly was not a fan, is still in some cases not a fan of our project, right? But we had to work with them, and we got an MOU, a memorandum of understanding, executed with the city. So And that was really important because the city of Beverly Hills was involved in all of our permitting and plan approvals. Um, Through this MOU, we demonstrated goodwill, and it paid off. It really paid off because at the beginning of COVID, Beverly Hills came to us and suggested that we expedite, right? And we saved many months off the schedule, especially at the Wilshire Rodeo, because they allowed us to close down and just get in there and get it done, right? And it's interesting too because I don't really believe that the city or the constituents. Actually, I just got a text from, thank you, Mike. We saved 8 months off the schedule. Thank you,
Wow.
Mike. So, anyways, and this was a classic example of prioritizing transit construction over single passenger vehicle throughput, because the contract said that there would be holiday moratoriums where we'd have to stay off the street, and it's about 8 weeks, right? That because they get 80% of their revenue during that holiday period. So it's really important for that community to be open during that time. But we were able to get full closure and just get in there and get it done, and save an inordinate amount off the schedule. And based on that, now there's even discussions that they're coming to us and asking us, is there other ways that we can do that, continue that moratorium? Because they've realized that if they allow us to get in there and get what we need to get done, we can get out of their way and they can get back to their life as usual. But that's not the normal way things are done. This is a unique story in this particular perspective, because we usually have to work in and around the community and, do decking every night, or all. So, and that takes time, and it's a lot longer of a interruption in the community as opposed to getting in and getting it done. So I hope possibly that story bleeds over to other cities that might take shape as well.
Yeah, 8 months of schedule saving is I mean, I don't assume what that translates into cost savings, but I assume that an 8 month schedule savings is substantial in terms of the cost. And it is, it was one of the things that came out not just in the LA region, but in other regions, that there's a huge kind of low hanging fruit there in terms of boosting those schedules by having more short term disruption for long term gain. And I'm going to open this up to others on the panel. Just feel free to jump in. How do we kind of change that paradigm, right, and make that not the exception, but make it the rule, where we're coming in there and we're just gonna we're gonna get the project done. We don't have to do all of the decking and stuff that takes a tremendous amount of time, and then the project's finished much faster.
I think that we need to be able to demonstrate early on, the either or, with the sophisticated tools we have now, to do schedule and cost analysis, very, very early in the planning process, even during the, community involvement, present the, we could be out of your way in 1 year instead of 2 years. But there's going to be a little bit of pain involved, and maybe to offset that pain, in addition to the schedule savings, there might be some other kind of mitigations, betterments, to offer the community to just make that alternative a bit more enticing to them, because the cost isn't going to be what sways them, right? It's the reduction in the impact period.
Got it. Yeah, that makes sense. And Rick, it looks like you were going to say something, and I think you were on mute, so
sorry,
go ahead.
I had my mic muted. On the Expo line, we found that it was very important to work with third parties, the cities. In this particular case, we wanted to shut down one of the biggest arterial roads or highways in LA for a period of time. And what we had to do is basically put together different schedules and walk the city through step by step what it would take to do the project, shut down the road altogether, and basically prove to them the time savings. And then once we got their approval to do it, we had to deliver, because if we didn't deliver and overran, they wouldn't let us do it again.
Mhm.
So we worked with the contractor to ensure that we could deliver with what we said we could do. And it worked out so well, we were able to do a couple other streets the same way.
That's great. You got to prove yourself. Very good. So I'm looking at the time here. We've got about 5 minutes or so before we have to wrap up. We've covered a lot of ground, and I want to make sure that you're able to put in some of the things that perhaps we missed, or some other important points about project delivery, things that you've learned, things you've noted, things that you would recommend others, right? A lot of the folks on the phone here are calling in from transit agencies around the world. They want to know the best practices, and they want to know things they can take back to their own projects and their own communities on how we can make for better outcomes. So let's go around the horn one more time with some final closing thoughts, and perhaps things that you'd like us to make sure that we either emphasize or touch on. And we'll start with you, Ray, since I don't think you've had a chance here to respond to this last question. But we'll go Ray, and then Lisa, and then Rick, and then Julie.
All right, thank you. I do have a long list, given what we've been monitoring in providing oversight to the LA projects over the last 2 decades. A lot of these are tools that I mentioned previously that can be used and implemented easily enough. Certainly, better definition of utilities. As you know, across the country, we are struggling with utilities. It's not only when you go in, you find them, and sometimes they're in older cities, they fall apart. It's that you don't find them, or you hit them where you don't expect them. So as-builts are certainly not in the quality that we would hope for. So the lesson learned also there is to provide the appropriate duration when you're structuring your schedule for the project, and in turn your budget. There seems to be an optimism that you can clear out utilities in no time, right? And that's a misnomer. That is just not the case. This is an unknown, right? And so you need to address that with the appropriate duration, so you're not getting into trouble later on. The other aspect of that is how extensive your exploration is, how extensive your identification program is. Extensive potholing is certainly essential. We found out in projects in LA where you do cross sectional, you almost have to do longitudinal potholing, so that you get and directional drilling, so you get as best a opportunity to understand what the utilities are looking like. The other thing is survey verification. You've got to look at what the surveys are saying, and then have a second pair of eyes verify that, so that you're not running into trouble once you start digging, or once you encounter anything. Anything you do under the ground is again an unknown, right? So you have to take all of the precautions up front, because that's where it pays dividends. So that's critical. Survey verification. Even when you do utilities, sometimes you're only doing utilities to the top of the utility. You're forgetting about the bottom, or the width, or the dimensions in its entirety. And then the contractor comes through, and they're not finding what you said they would find, right? Or just the opposite. They're encountering stuff that was not anticipated. On the geotechnical side, same way. The best quality instrumentation, invest the money up front in terms of what you can do in terms of historical tracing. Was there a gas station at this site? Was there a dry cleaner? All of that. Contamination is very, very expensive to clean up. More emphasis on quality control residing with the project sponsor. And then with real estate, you said, why was the Wilshire project that expensive? That is one of the busiest corridors in the country. So the cost of real estate on that corridor, even if it were sub surface easements was astronomical. Then you're tunneling through methane and other gases that really requires engineering of a different level, but geotechnical. Then you're dealing with earthquake faults, right? So all of that adds up costs, and you need experts, and you need experts upfront to bring that expertise. So you're dealing with this, so you know what you're going to be dealing with. So Metro did a wonderful thing on the West Side project. They dug an exploration shaft, right, to understand the geotechnical, the strata of the underground elements. But real estate is the same way. You have to understand what real estate you might need for tiebacks and other aspects in a project, right, that remain after the project is completed, the piles, so on and so forth. So I'm going to stop here to give others a chance, but there's a long list of laundry items that Metro has implemented, from lessons learned from, and I must take credit and give credit to FTA and the PMOC bringing some of those elements to the forefront where they can be addressed. And that is investment upfront that pays huge dividends once the project gets started and the tunnel boring machine is in the ground.
Yeah, that's good to hear. And the utility relocation was certainly something that came up a lot in our interviews and was a highlight of our LA case. And that early identification, is investing in that early on, pays huge dividends. So that's good to hear. Lisa, your thoughts?
Well, it's hard to pile on to that really insightful list from Ray, but two quick things I would add. And I know at least one of these, if not both, were touched on in the report. One is standardization. And this is something Metro's been moving to, certainly with the stations. There's a kit of parts now developed to, just make the design and construction of stations more cost efficient. Secondly is the whole procurement process, and just looking at that to be as efficient as possible, and continuing to look for ways to shorten the procurement process for the delivery phase, whether it's design build or progressive design build. I think there's still some opportunities there to gain some time and budget.
Yeah, the standardization piece certainly jumped out to us when we were looking at other countries. So I'm glad you mentioned that one. We're going to do Rick and finish up with you, Julie. Rick, you're on mute still.
Yeah, I did it again.
That's okay.
I'll try to be fairly quick here. And like Ray, I have a huge list, but I'm just going to mention a couple of things to start with. One of the things we certainly learned is having sufficient budget and sufficient schedule before you get started on a project. If not, like on Expo Phase 1, we thought we could kind of pay as we go and didn't really have all of the funds we needed. That turned out to be, from a political perspective, not a very good choice on our part. So I think the key is make sure that you have sufficient budget, including contingency, before you tackle one of these projects. And don't be too optimistic on your schedule. The other thing I found is what can really kill a project schedule-wise is third parties. They're not set up to handle all the work for one project, let alone all the projects that LA is undertaking right now. We had to work with, for example, Southern Cal Edison electric company. Well, they had their existing staff. We offered to help them and pay for additional staff, but there was a learning curve associated with that. And we wound up working with them, but there were significant delays that we had to overcome by accelerating the work once the design was complete. We wound up paying the contractor acceleration funds in order to get the project on Expo Phase 2, for example, back on schedule. So those are some of the things. You got to work very closely with the third parties early on, as early as you possibly can, knowing that they have limited resources, just like you do.
That's a really, really good insight. I really like that collaboration, working with those third parties, the relationships. Really, really important points. Okay, Julie, you have the last word before we conclude.
Okay. I wanted to chime in and add on to what Ray was saying, and also Rick, related to utility relocation for just a moment, because we actually have some lessons learned that wanted to implement. As Ray mentioned, making sure that you have adequate schedule related to utilities. So one of the things we do is we have advanced utility relocation contracts that we do in advance of. So it's a separate procurement that we do to get those utilities out of the way before we ever have the design build contractor get started. And then another lessons learned that we had actually that was really great that worked on the West Side program is we implemented BIM to do a couple different things. One, to map the existing utilities. So the as-built, Ray mentioned potholing, pothole, check your as-builts, make sure you know where those utilities are, map those utilities out in a three-dimensional layout so that you can then overlay the existing utilities and your new utilities that you need to put, or your relocated utilities, so you can do clash detection and things of that nature before you ever get into the field, right? And that was a huge help on the West Side program. We also have looked at, in some cases, we're looking at this on the East San Fernando project with the Department of Water and Power, getting them to relocate their own utilities in some cases. So there's that too. So that's just a couple quick ideas. I have a longer list, but I know we don't really have a lot of time right now, so I'm just gonna cut it off. Thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate that. That's one of the challenges of doing these things in short hits is that I'm sure we could talk about this for the next 8 hours. And all of you mentioned that you have a huge list of things. And one thing I will like to share about this event is that if you do, those listening in, if you have a question or things that you want to follow up on, just let us here at Eno know, and we can connect you with the right person. The folks on the phone here and throughout the symposium have a tremendous wealth of experience and expertise, and it's really all about learning from each other and making sure we're taking those best practices and putting them in place. So I want to thank our panel very much for taking the time to talk with us today, and we promise to stay engaged with you all going into the future, and really, really appreciate your time and insights and expertise as part of this program. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you, Paul.
And our next session will begin in 22 minutes.